Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage Methodspace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Linda Bloomberg and Dr. Merle Werbeloff. And they're going to share their expertise in mixed methods research and design. But before we get started, if you're new to Methodspace, this is a blog that is sponsored by Sage Publishing. We're interested in everything to do with designing, planning, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the center of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's certainly why I enjoy having this kind of opportunity to talk with researchers from around the world and learn about all different kinds of approaches. So why don't you begin by introducing yourselves?
Okay, thanks so much, Janet, and thank you to Methodspace for having us here to present today. I'm Linda Bloomberg, and I'm the author of Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, a roadmap from beginning to end, which is a Sage publication, currently in its 5th edition. And I'm thrilled to work with Methodspace again, as I have over the course of many years, contributing to Sage resources. And I really hope that everybody's going to find this presentation today interesting and informative, and that's our hope.
And thank you for having me. I'm Merle Werbeloff, and I work with students on their quantitative theses and dissertations, and I'm very excited to be here today. So we can get going, I think.
Great. So I will start us off on today's presentation, which is Mixed Methods, Designs, and Methods. And I'd just like to talk for a moment about mixed methods being a multi-design methodology. In preparing this webinar, Merle and I realized very quickly that this really is a very extensive and complex field of research, and it's growing and constantly evolving. There are many, many different ways of cutting up and slicing and dicing mixed methods in the literature. And as a result, there are many different ways of actually conceptualizing mixed methods designs. There is no one way of doing it. And so please bear that in mind as we move through this webinar. Some of the common descriptive dimensions that apply to mixed methods include the following. Firstly, one has to take into account the purpose of the research. Second is the theoretical or conceptual orientation of the research and the researcher. Next is the relative importance of the weighting of the qualitative and quantitative data to be collected and analyzed. Following that is the purpose of the interface between the data sets. Then the timing of the interface between the data sets, whether it's simultaneous or successive or sequential. And finally, the number of points of the interface and the degree of integration that is required and strived for, whether it's fully or partially integrated or mixed, or whether it's a single or multi-strand study. So as you can see, there are many different concepts and many different factors that play into mixed methodologies. Having said that, I'd like, Merle and I would really like to position this discussion to start off right at the very outset by saying that because there are so many different ways of conceptualizing the field and the designs that can be applied to mixed method studies, and because of the diversity across the areas and disciplines and the many different voices of the researchers and writers who write about mixed methods, there really is a lack of consensus within the field overall. And there are many, many ways of designing mixed method studies. So bearing that in mind, please understand that what we're going to be presenting here today is just our view on mixed methods as we see it right now. But the field is evolving and complex. So bear that in mind as we move through today's presentation. There is a definition of mixed methods that I'd like to draw to your attention. And this actually is from Tasha Corey and Creswell in the very, very first edition of the Journal of Mixed Methods back in 2007, and still applies today. And I'm just going to read it to give us a broad overview of the field and to bear this in mind as we move through the presentation. Mixed methods is research in which the investigator or the researcher collects and analyzes data, integrates the findings, and draws inferences using both qualitative and quantitative approaches or methods in a single study or program of inquiry. I'm going to move for a few moments to a broader overview of mixed methods, just to again position our discussion and to give the listeners a little bit more of an idea of how we are going to situate today's presentation within this very broad and evolving field. So mixed methods is really quite a complex methodology that intentionally and systematically uses both qualitative and quantitative designs and methods in a single study. That's the important thing to remember. This methodology is chosen because of its strength in drawing on both qualitative and quantitative methodology. So it really gets the best of both worlds, bringing both of them together. And at a practical level, this methodology provides quite a sophisticated and complex approach to research, offering a holistic understanding of the findings of the study. So in collecting and analyzing the data, both qualitative and quantitative data are collected. Remember, the qualitative is the open-ended, the quantitative is the closed-ended data, and together, both of these forms of data contribute to the overarching research question and/or hypotheses of the study. Rigorous methods must be used for both qualitative and quantitative research. There is no way that one would compensate or lessen the integrity of either of the methods for the sake of the other. Each of them carries equal weight, but in different ways, as you will see, depending on the integration of the qualitative and quantitative strands. And the researcher strives to integrate or mix the two forms of data intentionally to generate new insights. Also, different philosophical assumptions are used to inform each of the designs, bearing in mind that qualitative and quantitative research are based on very different paradigmatic assumptions and very different philosophical bases. So both of these need to be integrated. And the point I'm trying to drive home is the complexity of this approach. Being so firmly grounded in both qualitative and quantitative necessitates skill and background knowledge in both methodologies in order to be successful. A basic assumption is that the combined qualitative and quantitative findings will lead to additional insights that cannot be gleaned from either qualitative or quantitative findings alone. And that really is a key assumption that all of the researchers and writers who write about mixed methods would agree upon, that there is the benefit of using both qualitative and quantitative to inform a study in a very, very rich but complex manner. An important logic is that together the methods complement each other to provide a more in-depth and comprehensive understanding of the findings. And this incorporates triangulating methods and data sources. And the complexity also calls for clear visual models or diagrams so that the reader of the study can really understand the details, the sequence, and the flow of the research activities. One final point that I'd like to make in talking about the overview of mixed methods itself is integration considerations. And maybe it's apparent from what I've said over the last few minutes is that the way that qualitative and quantitative data are integrated is the key difference that distinguishes the different designs that can be used in mixed methods. And it really is the defining feature of mixed methods research, this concept of integration. But as Fetters and Molina 2017 rightly point out, there is no widely agreed upon definition of integration. And different authors refer to integration in different ways and in different mannerisms. So again, hence the complexity of the field and the reason that we are choosing to focus on 4 main designs, but there are very many others out there based on integration consideration. I'm going to hand over now to Merle to move more deeply into today's presentation by showing you what we're going to do in this presentation.
Thank you. We're going to apply our discussion of mixed methods research to the all but dissertation example. It's a research problem that describes a phenomenon whereby a significant number of students in doctoral programs complete all their course requirements, yet do not go on to complete their research or their dissertations, so that they remain in a status of ABD, or all but dissertation. And we've drawn this from Bloomberg and Volpe 2019. We're also going to use two analogies. The first one is for quantitative methodology, and that's the analogy of a tractor plowing a large field. You can see the tractor looks very good. It uses excellent tools and methods, yet it's plowing the field fairly superficially, but it's trying to get to the entire field or field of inquiry. And that's very similar to quantitative research, which tries to generalize its findings to the entire population using excellent tools. But superficially, more superficially than the qualitative methodology, which is like a drill that drills down very deeply into a limited, small area of the field of inquiry, and it does so to get into the very depths of the problem. So we'll be referring to these two analogies throughout our presentation. Just to talk about a few of the key concepts of quantitative methodology. The designs in quantitative studies are set up to have good internal validity, tight controls of nuisance variables and extraneous variables using randomization, and methods that will facilitate quantitative and causal relationships to be drawn. The sampling is done in such a way, ideally using probability sampling methods, so that the sample results can be generalized to the entire population. Using measurements that are objective with strong psychometric properties of reliability and validity, and statistical analysis methods that are rigorous and objective, so that we can build and test models and test relationships and infer causal relationships. So the outcome of all this is quantitative research that is reliable and valid and repeatable and based on scientific principles.
Now, in contrast to quantitative research, qualitative research, remember, which is the drill metaphor, we're drilling down very deeply to understand findings very, very deeply and specifically, as opposed to the plow, which is more broad, trying to plow the entire field of inquiry. In qualitative research, the emphasis is on exploration, discovery, and description of a very, very specific and well-defined problem. Triangulation addresses trustworthiness by making use of multiple sources and multiple methods. And as opposed to quantitative research, the goal is not to produce truths that can be generalized, but rather for readers to decide for themselves whether the study's findings can or could apply to their own settings or contexts, a concept that is referred to as transferability, as opposed to generalizability. And this leads into the whole idea of rigor and trustworthiness in the field of qualitative research, where there are 4 criteria that a researcher would need to address in order to determine and set up the rigor and the trustworthiness of the particular study. These are credibility, which parallels internal validity in quantitative research, confirmability, which parallels objectivity. Remember, the goal of a qualitative researcher is not to be objective, because humans, in terms of qualitative research, the human is the researcher as the instrument, and a human being cannot be completely objective. So subjectivity is addressed and acknowledged very much so in qualitative research. The third trustworthiness criterion is dependability, which parallels reliability in quantitative research. And finally, transferability, which I mentioned a few moments ago, parallels generalizability, where the reader would decide for themselves, based on the description that is provided in the study, whether or not the findings could be applied to their own particular setting or context. Data collection in qualitative research draws upon multiple methods and involves multiple data sources. Methods can include things like individual interviews, observation, focus groups, critical incident questionnaires, document review, imagery review, and open-ended surveys, where individuals and participants are given the chance to explain in their own words, because remember, the words of the participants is what one really focuses on. That is the data in qualitative research. So instead of having closed-ended questionnaires or surveys where there would just be a yes or no answer or a Likert scale, there would be a chance for the individual participants to actually explain in their words what they understand. Triangulation is critical in attempting to obtain an in-depth understanding of the study and adds to the credibility of the study overall. Data analysis is very different as well compared to quantitative research. Analysis is an iterative and, quite honestly, very messy approach that continues throughout the study, right up until the end. Methods of data analysis include thematic analysis, content analysis, text and discourse analysis, and also visual analysis. Analysis can be manual, or the researcher could make use of qualitative data analysis software, of which there are many different types. The goal is to develop codes which are inductively drawn from the raw data, which are the individual interview transcripts, the focus group transcripts, and the visual imagery, etc. From the codes, the researcher will develop categories and themes which become the qualitative findings, and the findings are then reported in narrative manner using extensive verbatim samples of quotations from the research participants themselves in order to authentically represent their voice. Remember that designing a mixed method study must be based on the understanding of achieving a thoughtful and robust use of both qualitative and quantitative methods and designs, and the design, collection, analysis, and everything that goes along with the study is ultimately based on the underlying theoretical or conceptual framework that was selected for the particular study. There are 4 main mixed methods designs that we're going to be discussing in today's presentation. The first is convergent parallel, then the embedded, which are there are 2 different options, a qualitative dominant and a quantitative dominant option. Third is the explanatory sequential design. And finally, we're going to be talking about the exploratory sequential design.
So the convergent parallel mixed methods design is, as the name implies, where the quantitative and qualitative designs are conducted in parallel. So there's a one-phase design here. We have the quantitative data collection and analysis done in parallel with the qualitative data collection and analysis. Thereafter, the results are merged, which facilitates triangulation, and then compared and the findings interpreted. An example here would be answering a research question that asks, what makes a doctoral student withdraw from the program? So, from a quantitative perspective, we could use a survey design, and from a qualitative perspective, we could use an exploratory case study. Both designs would be conducted in parallel, and then the results analyzed and merged to answer possibly another research question, which would ask, what are the preemptive steps that can be taken to address the identified issues? The key assumption here is that quantitative and qualitative data, although different, they yield similar results and converge. But there is a caveat here that although it appears to be simple, it's a single-phase approach, the design can be complex because of the number of data collection and analysis activities that are going on concurrently, and these may require follow-up procedures when any divergence is picked up. Let's now go on to the embedded mixed methods design. So there are two here, and both involve a one-phase design. So in both, there's a dominant method and then a secondary method. In this first one, where we have a quantitatively dominant design, the quantitative data is dominant and the qualitative data collection and analysis would be secondary. Both would be analyzed concurrently, but the quantitative data would answer the primary research question, and the qualitative data, which is embedded in the quantitative, would answer and address the secondary research questions. An example here would be, while carrying out a large survey, a quantitative survey of doctoral students, a subset or a sample of the participants may be interviewed to augment the researcher's understanding of an important concept measured in the survey. Now, in the counterpart to this, where we have the qualitative data being dominant and the quantitative data being subservient or secondary, we would analyze the primary data to answer the primary research question and the secondary data to answer the secondary research questions. And the results that we get from the secondary data analysis would strengthen or supplement or support the primary research question. So an example of a qualitatively dominant embedded design is where, for example, we would be carrying out in-depth interviews of some doctoral students, and the participants would be asked to complete a quantitative questionnaire, perhaps measuring depression or anxiety. And these quantitative data would provide the researcher with objective diagnostic data on the participants, and that would support the entire piece of research. So let's now move on to the third main design, which is the explanatory sequential mixed design. And as the name implies, there's a sequence here. So we no longer have a one-phase design, we have two phases. In the first phase of an explanatory sequential design, we have quantitative data collection and analysis, which would allow us to identify results for follow-up in a second phase, qualitative data collection and analysis. And the results that we would get from the second phase would explain our quantitative results from the first phase. So let's have a look at an example. The research questions for an explanatory sequential model would ask, firstly, what are the critical points at which doctoral students withdraw from the program? Here you can see that we're talking about all doctoral students in a particular population, so this does lend itself to a quantitative analysis. Our second research question would ask, what is happening in the lives of these students at these critical points that are causing them to withdraw? That's a deeper question and would lend itself to a qualitative analysis. And finally, everything would come together to answer a third research question: what are the preemptive steps that can be taken to mitigate events related to the withdrawal of these students at these critical points? So let's have a look at the quantitative phase, which would address the first research question. What are the critical points at which the doctoral students withdraw from the program? The research design could be set up to be a retrospective study, where you're looking at events in the past. The population could be the entire population of registered doctoral students in the past year, or perhaps in the past 2 years or longer, depending on the size of the population. The sampling frame could be university records of attendance and grades, and the data that we collect from the database would be student-level data, that would be time-related information, data of academic performance, and fees that are paid, all indicators of the student dropping out or withdrawing from the program. And the analysis would be a statistical analysis to answer the research question of what are the critical time points of withdrawal. So here you have an example drawn from another study in which we can see where the drop-off is occurring. So in the beginning, at time 0 along our timeline, we've got our full complement of doctoral students. But after one of our periods, be that a milestone or a particular point in time, we have withdrawal of the students. So we have about a 15% withdrawal and a survival rate of about 85%. And then as time moves on, so we have fewer and fewer students surviving until time period 8 or milestone 8, where we have approximately a 62% survival rate. So this is one of the examples of research analysis methods that can be used in quantitative methods to answer a research question that is quantitatively based.
Now, as we move on with this explanatory sequential mixed methods study, remember, as Merle said, this is essentially a retrospective study. And once the quantitative portion has been conducted initially, the researcher would then move to the next sequence or the next phase, which is the qualitative phase. And in the qualitative phase, the research question is, what is happening in the lives of these students at the critical points that are causing them to withdraw from their program of study? So remember, we're now looking at a qualitative question. And to conduct this portion or this phase of the study, the researcher puts on their qualitative hat. They change hats now from the quantitative to the qualitative, and they would conduct a purposeful sampling of a group of retrospective students who identify as ABD. So now we're looking for a smaller subsample of the entire population of students that have withdrawn, and we're looking to research or drill very deeply down into the actual experiences of this sample of students that we are purposefully sampling to be part of our smaller group. We can use homogeneous, criterion, or snowball sampling techniques to get to this group. The sample size is relatively small because the intent is not to generalize the information, but rather to elucidate the particular by use of the drilling down very, very deep. And we're not looking to study a large representative sample, but rather to collect very detailed information from the participants in this much smaller sample. And to do so, we would gather our data or collect our data by way of instruments such as individual interviews, focus groups, an open-ended survey, a critical incident questionnaire or observation, etc. And the data analysis would be by way of coding and thematic analysis to develop themes, which become the study's findings for the qualitative phase of the study. Finally, once we have gathered or collected all of our quantitative and qualitative data and analyzed it, the researcher would then be moving towards the synthesis phase of the study, which is part of the entire integrated study, and answering a final research question which states, what are the preemptive steps that can be taken to mitigate events related to the withdrawal at these critical points that have been identified. So as you can see, everything comes together in a synthesis where the qualitative and quantitative data are collected in the same study. The analysis, interpretations, conclusions are drawn based on the quantitative results and the qualitative findings and integrated as a synthesized holistic study that is based on the underlying theoretical or conceptual framework that was selected in the first place on which to base or ground the study. So just to recap then, in the explanatory sequential design, which is our third design that we're presenting here today, the researcher and the research problem are more quantitatively oriented, which makes it, in effect, a way in which the study is started off or begun with the quantitative phase. The qualitative phase comes in as a secondary phase. The qualitative phase is implemented for the purpose of explaining the results of the quantitative phase in much more depth, drilling down much more deeply. And the qualitative data, in effect, helps to explain the quantitative results, hence the word explanatory sequential design. And once the qualitative phase is complete, the researcher will then integrate the two sets of data, the quantitative and the qualitative, to draw conclusions, and the results are explained in a synthesized fashion based on both phases of this explanatory sequential design. We're now going to move to the fourth and final design that we're discussing here today, which is the exploratory sequential mixed methods design. And the basic understanding of this design is also that it is a two-phase design, like the explanatory sequential design that we've just covered. But in this design, the first phase is the qualitative data collection and analysis, where we identify themes. The second phase is the quantitative testing of the feature. And finally, the results are interpreted and concluded to produce an overall synthesis. So an example based on the research problem that we've selected for this presentation, which is the problem of ABD, all but dissertation, there are 3 overall research questions for the exploratory sequential mixed method design with using this example. The first would be, what makes a doctoral student withdraw from their program? Second, to what extent are these themes characteristic of the population who withdraw from the doctoral program? And finally, the synthesis, what are the preemptive steps that can be taken to mitigate events related to withdrawal of doctoral students from their program? So the qualitative phase is the first phase in the exploratory sequential design. And so the research question that we focus on is a qualitative question which asks, what makes a doctoral student withdraw from their program? And to explore this particular question, as we would do in all qualitative designs or in the qualitative phase of a mixed methods design, we would purposefully sample a group of students. Now remember, here we're not doing a retrospective study, we're doing a current study. So here we would look at current students who are currently in their programs, but who identify as struggling within their programs. And to gain this purposeful sampling, the researcher would go out and collect a group of people, a smaller group of people, because remember, we're not looking to generalize, we're looking to drill down very deeply into a smaller group, a subset of the total population of students that are struggling. And we would create our sample by way of homogeneous criterion or snowball techniques. The sample size is small because the intent is not to generalize, but rather to elucidate the particular. The intent is not to study a large representative sample, but this much smaller group of people that have been purposefully selected to participate in the study. Data collection would be things like individual interviews, focus groups, open-ended surveys, or critical incident questionnaires, etc. And the analysis would be the process of coding and thematic analysis to develop themes, which are the study's findings of a qualitative phase.
And the second research question would be, to what extent are these themes characteristic of the population of students who withdraw from the doctoral program? So you can see here that we are generalizing, or we wish to generalize to the whole population of doctoral students, just like we want to plow the entire field. So our research here would be quantitative. In this quantitative phase, we could use a cross-sectional survey design using a questionnaire with content based on the themes that have been drawn from the qualitative analysis. Obviously, also integrated with the theoretical or conceptual framework. Our population would be our registered doctoral students currently, and our sampling frame would be university registration records and emails. We'd use probability sampling methods so that we can generalize our results without bias, and our data would be the survey responses. We could use a less or a more complex or sophisticated data analysis method. There are two real kinds of generation techniques. The first generation techniques of data analysis are simple descriptive analyses based on themes, involving methods like correlation, analysis of variance, regression, exploratory factor analysis, and so on. And then there are the more sophisticated second generation data analysis methods that involve, for example, structural equation modeling, incorporating unobserved or latent variables, accounting for measurement error in the observed variables, and testing complex networks of relationships. So an example of a structural equation model is this, drawn from another study. But basically, structural equation modeling involves a measurement model whereby we measure our latent constructs using indicators or items of questionnaires, and a structural model which involve the interrelationships of constructs. And structural equation model would assess the fit of the model we have drawn to the data and validate the model. So basically, the qualitative phase of this mixed method design has identified the features or the constructs, the themes that we've used to build our quantitative model. And we then test our quantitative model using structural equation modeling or some other technique. And that would explain the withdrawal of doctoral students from the program, so we hope. So to summarize the exploratory sequential design, here the researcher and the research problem are more qualitatively oriented, and this design starts with the inductive approach. And the entire goal is to develop and apply a quantitative measure like a model based on a survey that is grounded in qualitative data. Here we got our themes, our constructs from our qualitative phase of the analysis.
Thanks, Merle. I think our listeners can see how complex the quantitative and qualitative components of all of the designs are, and the very thoughtful way in which a researcher would approach a mixed method study, rather than just haphazardly mixing qualitative and quantitative, but rather thinking very carefully about what the end goal is, what the intention of the research is, what the purpose of the research is based on the research problem, and then making an appropriate design choice. So what we've developed here for listeners is a checklist for designing a mixed method study, which was adapted from Creswell and Creswell 2018. And these are the kind of questions one should be asking not just at the beginning and not just throughout the study, but even at the end, once you've conducted the study, just to check yourself that you have in fact very thoughtfully set up the study in the most logical and meaningful way. Ask yourself, is a basic definition of mixed methods provided in my study? Are the reasons for using both qualitative and quantitative data provided? Does the reader have a good sense for the potential use of mixed methods research? Have I identified the specific criteria for choosing the mixed methods design that I've selected? Is the specific mixed methods design identified and explained clearly enough? Have I presented a visual model or diagram to illustrate my research strategy, which in most cases will be complex, even if it's a single-phase design? Are the procedures of data collection and data analysis clearly outlined in my dissertational thesis? Are specific analytic procedures explained in enough detail? Are procedures for validation for the quantitative phases and trustworthiness for the qualitative phases explained and outlined sufficiently? And finally, have I synthesized my study's quantitative and qualitative findings and integrated the synthesis within the theoretical or conceptual framework for my research? Take note, there are certain caveats that we really do want our listeners to be aware of. And this goes back to the very beginning of this presentation when we said that there are very many different ways of setting up a mixed method study, and that scholars in the field have described various mixed methods design options. So there is no real consensus. That said, please work with your advisor and doctoral committees to determine the best mixed methods design for your particular study based on your study's purpose, the complexity of the design, your research skills as a student researcher, and the time frame required to conduct your study. I would also just like to point out that a lot of the material from the qualitative aspect of this presentation is based on the 5th edition of my book, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, A Roadmap from Beginning to End, which is published with Sage Publications and currently in its 5th edition.
And I just want to, in case you don't know me, introduce myself again as Merle. My address is merle@statsauntie.com. You're welcome to contact me. I help students accelerate and complete their proposals, their dissertations, and their theses.
So
Our
what
reference,
oh, sorry, Merle, go ahead.
we've used a number of references for this presentation. Here they are, and there are many more. But these are very useful and good, and you're welcome to take them down from our presentation. And we just want to thank Janet and Sage for having us today.
Yes, thank you so much, Janet.
Thank you to both of you. It's been interesting to me over the last year, whether I was talking with qualitative researchers, editor of qualitative journals, or with, on the other side, people working in computational social science. The one thing they both have pointed to is the importance of mixed methods, that, this is really, what we need to consider. So I think you've given a great explanation that will help people just begin to think through the options and understand, what would go into making the design decisions. So thank you, and I hope that our Methodspace readers will find this to be beneficial as they move forward with their own research designs.